Now on BBC2, The Late Show.
On The Late Show tonight, the great Channel 3 franchise debate. We've assembled some key players. The man who paid £2,000 for a franchise reckoned to be worth $232 million a year in advertising revenue. The man who lost a franchise despite bidding $16 million. The man who's contemplating legal action against the ITC. And the man who thinks this was the better way. Good evening. The franchise auction has dominated every news programme since early morning. But if by any remote chance you missed the details, the story is, out of the 16 ITV franchises, only 4 changed hands. 2 of them because they didn't bid high enough. TVAM, the network's most lucrative franchise, lost to Sunrise Television, and Thames Television is to be replaced by Carlton Television. And 2 because they bid too high. Television South West lost to West Country Television, and TBS is to give way to Meridian. The franchise auction was held in 2 stages. First, the Independent Television Commission assessed all 40 bids for the 16 licenses on the grounds of quality. Only after that process did the ITC open the envelopes containing the money. We invited both the ITC and the government to take part in the debate tonight, but they both declined. Well, before the free-for-all, I'm joined by Raymond Snoddy of the Financial Times, who's the acknowledged expert on the intricacies of the Channel 3 auction. His franchise forecast in The Late Show last week was just about spot on. First of all, is this good news for the viewers?
It's a lot better news for the viewer than I thought earlier this morning. Not all the money is going to be handed over to the government. There might be some money left to make programmes with.
And what are some of the best stories? What's the best story of this lottery?
Well, first of all, the attitude, the words. It's fear, it's panic, it's what on earth to put into the brown envelope. My favourite story involves Gus MacDonald of Scottish. He was a very brave man indeed. The day before the deadline for the bids, £2,000 bid went down to London in the brown envelope, and he sat back and waited and relaxed. And then the call came the next morning, and before the deadline was over, another rival is arriving, and he suddenly, I suspect his life has been shortened by the experience. It was a false alarm. Gus MacDonald has held his franchise.
But Scottish with a £2,000 bid, Central with a £2,000 bid, right next door to Central Yorkshire with a £37 million bid. What kind of signal does that give to viewers about the way the independent television networks run?
Well, it's a signal about the rather bizarre nature of this competitive tendering system. People didn't really know what opposition they faced. They couldn't be sure, and some people simply had to bid high out of this sense of fear, the desperation that they didn't want to lose their franchise at all costs.
If Mrs. Thatcher is watching The Late Show tonight, do you think she'll be smiling contentedly at the new system?
I think she'd be deeply suspicious of broadcasters talking all this talk about quality, and she might notice that if there hadn't been quite so much talk about quality, an extra $100 million a year will be going to the Treasury tonight.
Well, for now, Ray, thank you. But let's get some stories about this blind auction, because basically a lot of you, it was a game of poker putting an amount of money in the envelope. First of all, Harry Turner, you lost with that system. How did you decide on that figure? I mean, how did you put that money in?
Well, first of all, let me say, I don't think Man King Ludwig of Bavaria could have conceived a more ludicrous system, but we knew we had competition and we were determined to win. We played exactly by the rules. We know we passed the quality hurdle with flying colours and we made the highest bid. This seemed to us quite reasonable, and we lost, so it's bizarre. How we arrived at the bid was very simple. We arrived at it initially in 1991 prices, and the figure we arrived at was 14 million. And when we agreed on 14 million, before we upgraded it to the 1993 prices, we all sat quietly in the boardroom. And my chairman, Sir Brian Bailey, said, "That figure's too round." We said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, it's too even, too round." So we added the date, and we arrived at a figure which when we inflated it to 1993 prices, it came to £16,117,000. I knocked off the 2p because it didn't seem worthwhile. But I'm not actually in a terribly happy mood. This is the most fun I've had all day. We do feel cheated. We feel that we played by the rules and they've moved the goalpost at the last moment.
But Leslie Hill, let's turn to the completely other end of the spectrum. 2,000 quid. Did you sit in the boardroom and say, how low can we go?
Well, I mean, we decided that we would pass the quality hurdle, and that the quality hurdle in our region would be very high, and that unless we had a very strong bidder against us, there was no need to bid any more than we bid. I mean, clearly, we couldn't be 100% certain that there wasn't going to be another bidder, but we were virtually certain because we had our intelligence network in the region.
And you bought up everybody else anyway?
No, we didn't do that at all. We were able to feel fairly confident that there was no other bidder against us. So we bid. I mean, I think...
But you could have bid 1,000
the point about this was you either had to bid very high to beat a good competitor, or you could afford to bid very low if no one else was going to pass the quality hurdle.
But just on that point that was made earlier by Harry Turner, I mean, bidding high as you go, I mean, do you think there was a sense around that the ITC might crump down on people who bid too high?
Well, yes, I always thought that. I mean, I find some of the levels of the bids quite extraordinary, because based on the cost of running our region, we could not have bid the kinds of figures which I've seen banded about. So I don't think we were ever going to be a high bidder, because we couldn't do what we do in our region with our regional programme service, and also do the other things we do, with a very high bid.
Gus MacDonald also bidding 2,000. How are you so confident that there wasn't going to be any opposition?
Well, Scotland, as you know, Kirsty, is a bit of a village, and I think it would have been very difficult after seeing how complex this process was. I mean, it cost us £4 million, and I think we had 20 sets of consultants working with us to get it right. Nobody else could have done that in Scotland without us noticing. So I was reasonably confident up until the end. The argument about the £2,000 was really that the bid had to be in multiples of 1,000. So we had a metaphysical argument with the lawyers where I said 1 times 1 is 1, bid 1,000. But they forced me to bid twice as much.
Yorkshire Television, Clive Leach, the other end of the spectrum, right bang next door to Central Television, and you bid £37 million.
Yes, we did, and it was a perfectly reasonable bid. We were up against, as Leslie just said, 2 very good competitors. And as Leslie, I agree with him, you either bid high to win, or you hope and throw the dice that the others won't get through the quality barrier. Now, in our case, one did, and if we had followed the route of a couple of other winners with a lower bid, we would have lost. What I do know, very simply, is that we tabulated very clearly the returns against investment for our shareholders. We were fortunate enough to have 2 of our shareholders sitting round that table with us, 40% of our shareholding. They were very happy with the bid and very happy with the return they're going to get over the next 10 years.
Race Noddy?
Clive Leach, I can reveal exclusively to you now that in the Lex financial comment column in tomorrow's Financial Times, they take you very much to task for your bid, and they say that those 2 shareholders that you say were happy with the bid should have stopped you getting out of hand. What do you think about that?
Well, I think Lex is entitled to use his columns to say what he likes. We know the projections that we've got. We also, I must remind you, put before the ITC all the sensitivity tests that they asked us to apply to it, including sensitivity test C, which tracked through the entire 10-year period a 3% drop in revenue and a 3% increase in cost. And our bid stood up to that very comfortably indeed, as the ITC themselves accepted clearly that it would sustain the service.
Briefly, I'd like to ask Harry Turner, do you feel rather aggrieved that this man has got home and dry with a bid that actually isn't all that different from yours on a pro rata basis?
No, I'm not aggrieved at all. I wish Clive good luck. I'm aggrieved that having played by the rules and having also applied a sensitivity test and having passed the quality hurdle with flying colours, we get dumped. I think that's absolutely bizarre. It's Byzantine. I can't understand why. Because our business plan was very robust, and indeed it was verified by 2 of the best financial advisors in the country.
Right, let's move on to... Sorry, could you just come back?
I must come back, because I think it's... I have to take Ray to task. Let's go through the 7 people who bid in a very competitive situation. Start with Sunrise. Their bid as a percentage of advertising revenue is way above everybody else, and the other 6 who have competed equally were in the same bracket of between 25 and 35% of advertising revenue being bid.
Right, well, let's just hang on, Ray. I'd like to move on now to talk a bit more about the quality threshold, and particularly Brian Cowgill from Lagan Television. Over 30 years in television, your bid against Ulster failed at the quality threshold. I mean, what does that say to you about your abilities in that field?
Well, I mean, I was faintly embarrassed, but I have had no reason to lose confidence in my abilities or those of my colleagues. You see, we failed on the grounds of the quality of the programs we were offering. Our other rival applicant, TVNI, failed on the grounds of having made a bid which was beyond their capacity to sustain a reasonable program output. They made the highest bid and were kicked out. We had by a mile the most qualitative and interesting selection of program offers and failed on the quality threshold. And both Lagan and TVNI have come to the inescapable conclusion that, and a suspicion for which we may be forgiven, that the ITC may have been listening to a different drummer, and the intention all along may have been, in that very volatile province, have been to maintain the status quo.
Briefly, before I go on to talking about the quality threshold, what about that point the ITC might have been listening to a different drum recently?
Well, speaking as someone who actually comes from that part of the world, surely there is maybe just a case for exceptional circumstances, for stability, for broadcasters who actually have handled that difficult situation, which has actually involved the need for considerable bravery on the part of broadcasters in the past. Maybe I'd be probably more critical of the ITC in other areas rather than that one.
Well, someone who's very critical of the ITC is Richard Branson. Now, your CTV franchise bid failed on the grounds of quality as well, but you are not going to let it rest there. I mean, what are you going to do?
Well, I think that it's worth pointing out that I think only 3 non-incumbents passed the quality threshold. Everybody else was disqualified. And I'd like to also, just to try to illustrate a point, today...
Wouldn't be a bit of advertising.
Of course. Today, we started a little airline 7 years ago, and it is actually a point worth illustrating. Everybody thought we were mad and we knew nothing about the airline business. And today we were given the award for the best quality business class airline in the world. And it's very difficult. If you're starting afresh in a new business and you're just putting an envelope in and they don't see you, they don't have the trouble to come and question you about it, it's very, very difficult to beat the incumbents. And I think that personally that the ITC have protected their incumbents throughout. They've only given 3 new people a go, and I think that a lot of those people that have been turned down could have brought a breath of fresh air to television. And we're aggrieved because we did bid the most for Thames. And we had a great team of people, and we believe that we should have been given the chance to have a go.
And you are prepared to take this on as far as you have to?
We would like the ITC to tell us why we didn't pass the quality threshold, and if we're not satisfied with what they tell us, then I feel we should have somebody, a judicial body, adjudicate and say whether they're right or whether we're right. But we definitely feel that the ITC should give us the right to let us know why.
Well, before we carry on with other aggrievements, Jento Vilesnovsky, you as a free marketeer, as an advisor to the Peacock Committee, as an advisor to various broadcasting committees, were shaking your head there when Richard Branson was saying that, in fact, you know, the quality threshold is something that should be openly discussed. The ITC should have to account for what it did.
Yes, if I can just make a comment on the quality hurdle. I was involved quite heavily in one bid in the HTV region, the C3W bid, which was the only outside bidder to pass the quality hurdle. And we actually passed that quality hurdle about 3 times before we got to the ITC, because we were in negotiations with other parties, and we had a particular strategy. The strategy was that we felt that the ITC required credibility in terms of the people that were in the team. So we went out and hired a lot of people who would actually run the operation, and we had that backing our programming. So the quality hurdle, I think, was fair, but people interpreted it in different ways. And so I think it allowed outsiders to come in. But turning now to the actual franchising process itself, I think the franchising process was the best in the circumstances. Now, I know a lot of people are going to disagree, but it led to greater efficiency within the ITV system. I think it was more open competition for the franchises. The reasons are fairly apparent why one or other people lost, because they failed to pass the program quality hurdle, or they bid too much. And it was always clear to people who bothered to talk to the ITC that if you bid too much, your business plan was going to be scrutinised.
Yeah, let's just stick with it, the quality threshold again. Does that answer your point, Richard Branson? Have you done your homework better, basically, is what's being said here?
I mean, I happen to disagree. Colton and ourselves had a very, very similar approach. We were going out to independent people and bringing in their programming. We had very good people to run the channel, and we believe that somebody used a very subjective judgment at the ITC to disbar us from getting through.
Phil Redmond, same position, you fighting Northwest Television against Granada. Subjective view at the ITC?
Yeah, I think so. I think Richard said most of what I wanted to say on that. Just on Chento's point about the quality threshold, I think one of our problems we're finding a bit mystifying at the moment is that for example, not to embarrass Clive, but if Yorkshire's interpretation of the quality threshold in Yorkshire seemed to pass and Tyne-Tees' interpretation of the quality threshold in Tyne-Tees seemed to pass, why is it that Yorkshire, Tyne-Tees and ourselves' interpretation of the same clause, section 16.2, actually didn't pass? But I think it's actually quite easy for us to all get sort of sidetracked into this, you know, sort of boys' own adventure discussion of bids and things, because all the bids fell within a very sort of close percentage of the overall revenue. My real disappointment in all this process is that the two fundamental points of the broadcasting legislation and what the invitation apply was supposed to do was to allow new entrants to bring new ideas and new innovation into the system. And with greatest respect to some of my colleagues in Carlton and Meridian, if you actually look right across what the system we've ended up with, we haven't ended up with anything that's...
But is it not just a bit of bad grace here, Phil Redmond? No, just let me come in here on this point, please.
No, just wait a minute. They take money out of the ITV system, and they haven't actually done that.
It's not bad grace.
They stand there with relish and say that they're going to take £200 million away from the Treasury. And yet, just ask the question, how can the BBC, on the same level of revenue, actually produce 2 national channels, 5 radio channels, all the local radio, all its contribution to the Open University, the Wales Service and all the rest of it, for a similar amount of money that ITV thinks it needs to produce 1 channel? And then to talk about taking money away from programming, it's actually hypocrisy at its highest level.
Right, well, you are sitting side by side in the studio in our terms, but several miles apart in Manchester from the person you were bidding against, Steve Morrison. Now, your battle in particular was pretty acrimonious, Steve Morrison. I mean, just why couldn't you come to an agreement? Why not even perhaps offer Phil Redmond a slice of your cake?
Well, Phil Redmond was and is an independent producer. If he's got very good ideas that would work on ITV, Granada would be delighted to commission them.
Just waiting for you to return the call, Steve.
What this franchise contest was about was whether Granada or Phil Redmond in Mersey Television, Northwest Television, was a more fit candidate to be the Northwest broadcaster. And I don't accept in the slightest Phil's point that if Tyne-Tees passed the threshold in Tyne-Tees, that's fine. If Yorkshire passed it in Yorkshire, that's fine. Why didn't Tyne-Tees, Yorkshire and Merseyside and Mersey pass it in the Northwest? The fact is that Phil's bid was totally different from Yorkshire and Tyne-Tees' bid. His programmes throughout the day, the evening and the night were completely different from either of his two partners' bids, which when I read his bid, I was so surprised by this that I wondered why Yorkshire and Tyne-Tees was backing his bid, because not one of his programme ideas was in their bid.
Rhys Noddy.
Yeah, first of all, could I ask Mr. Morrison?
Yes, Sir Alan Peacock, do come in. You've been
I'm
the man
sorry,
that's been
but
called
if this
the man
programme
who's
is
seeded
meant
the
to
seal of the
interest
century.
viewers, if I were a viewer of this programme, I think I would have switched off by now. The amount of
Well,
naval
viewers with us.
contemplation, it's all about television people talking about television. It's not about what is the interest of viewers in this question. And, of course, the whole purpose of this franchise arrangement, at least as I saw it and my colleagues saw it, because we suggested an arrangement, something of this sort, was it was to the benefit of viewers. And the idea was, of course, that we were going to cream off some of the monopoly profits of the television system, and these would in some way benefit the viewers. They could be now, the Treasury view of this was we cream off 250 million or whatever it is, and that means either a reduction in taxation elsewhere or extra public expenditure. Our view on the committee was rather different, which was this might be a pot of gold which you could use to finance quality broadcasting, and it would be in the interest of the viewers. All I've heard tonight is about the whole problem of the redistribution of profits between television companies, nothing about the viewer's interest.
Well, right, you when you actually set up the committee originally, it was, of course, to look at the BBC, and it was turned around to look at independent broadcasting. You had the viewers in mind. You tell me if you think the system that has been devised now was a system that you would have been happy with.
Well, I think it's a bit better than anything could have been better than the system before, and I think there could have been better arrangements. I mean, among other things, I mean, it's absurd that you didn't have any kind of reserve price. So the possibility, I mean, the idea that central television and STV, I wish them well. I live in Scotland, and it may be that they've got away with murder on this. The idea there wasn't a reserve price. And to anybody to suggest that this is compensated by the fact that they're going to have to pay percentage of the revenue, that is complete nonsense.
Leslie Hill of Central Breaking, he wants to
I
respond.
Peacock understands what the system is.
I certainly do understand the system.
Price.
I think I understand it, but I've mentioned the auction assisting better than you do.
There is a reserve price because we have to pay 11% of our revenue to the Treasury, which is over £20 million a year. That is the reserve price.
That's nothing of the kind. If you bid, if you had a reserve price, and then you knew what it was in advance, that would have affected the nature of your bid. You would have bid less, because that would have been the nature of the financial calculation which you've made. They're independent. You cannot argue the two things are separate.
It so happens that 11% of our revenue is not that different from the levy that we currently pay to the Treasury, so it's a very significant sum of money.
Right,
well, I wonder, yes, you never were placed in the position where you had to make this exact calculations of the kind which, for example, had to be made by TSW.
I'm sorry, we absolutely were, and I have to say this, that as I said before when I made my first remarks, we would never have made a very high bid because we could not have provided the service to the viewer that we do supply in our region and made a very high bid.
Professor Peacock, I'm really rather interested to know that despite all your caveats, you did start this hare running 5 years ago of competitive tendering. On the whole, are you happy with what you've done, or is there something on your conscience?
No, there's nothing on my conscience about this. I mean, this is a perfectly respectable way of allocating scarce resources. It's been done in cable in the United States and other places. The problem is in cable, you charge a price. And therefore, you give the cable franchise, subject to quality constraints and so on, to those who offer the lowest price to the viewer. You can't do that, of course, in a regime where you don't have subscription television. But you know as well as I do, Raymond, that the whole system of the franchise was based on the fact that our various recommendations were accepted in the round. And I think that is the problem. The government cherry-picked their way, and they said, this is an interesting one. We've got to deal with the franchise system, and we'll pick this one out.
Kirsty?
Do you think we could get away from this rather ingrained and
let's
entirely obscure subject?
Well, I've tried very hard, haven't I?
Thank you very much indeed, Sir Alan. But representing 1,000 independent producers here out of the Producers Alliance for Cinema and Television, surely the point here is, has this system just got to a position where it will provide a better ITV service, yet still provide profits to those companies which are going to operate it? Surely that's what we should be talking about.
You tell me
as far as I'm concerned, speaking as an independent producer, certainly the introduction of 40% of the advertising revenue represented by two major companies with companies who don't intend to make programs yet intend to publish programs is a significant stone into a rather stagnant pool, and we've been looking at that rather stagnant pool in great detail this evening.
Will White from BBC, from your point of view, the idea of publisher, broadcaster, the model that Meridian and Carlton are going to follow, a good one perhaps?
Well, I think Charles makes a very good point in that it's all very well people saying, oh, the system is much the same as it was. I don't think it will be with both Meridian and Carlton coming in. That will change the nature of the ITV schedule considerably. It will certainly give a big boost to independent producers in this country.
Yes. And who suggested that the independent producer should be given a cut? It was, of course, my committee who suggested that in the first place, and the government accepted that and accepted 25%. We suggested 40%, you may remember, over a period of 10 years.
Within the next 2 or 3 years.
Indeed you did, Professor. But Charles Denton, just remind us, in your view, how inefficient was ITV? Was this a system that had to be shaken up, and that the government may have done it in a crude way, but they've done it ultimately for the benefit of the viewer?
It's not my role to suggest how inefficient ITV might have been in the past. What one should be looking at now is what is the way to get the best programme service on the network in the future. all of these gentlemen have got local obligations which they will continue to produce because that will be a contractual obligation. What is important is how they will get the network schedule which will win. Win against the BBC in the phony war which now exists, then in the end win in the real competitive war when Sky puts itself on the horizon with real advertising
income. Let's bring in one of the
income.
new incumbents, Meridian, in here. How do you answer that point from Charles Deb?
I don't answer it, I support it. I think a revolution is taking place, and it may take place quicker than people who've been in the system, like I have for many years, are realising. The revolution is that broadcasting and production are separate activities. And the most effective way to supply programmes is almost certainly going to be to contract them out for all but long-running regular strands in the future. That's going to change the nature of British television very dramatically, and it's that future change that I think we haven't been talking about today when we talk about levels of bids and the history of the past. It's Byzantine.
Well, let's pick up on that with Gus MacDonald particularly. I mean, you've been critical of the way that the system has worked in the past. Do you think that these 4 companies changing hands is really going to revolutionise the system?
Yes, I think it's a very useful stimulus. It's interesting that the changes have generally taken place in the southeast of England and the south of England. That's where the independent producers are concentrated. In the north, I think that you need the critical mass represented by Granada and Manchester or Scottish in Glasgow in order to fight your way into that system and make it a bit more British, because at the moment it's very metropolitan in all 4 channels.
I'm not convinced. Well, let's pick up. Can I just get a viewer's point on this, because we are dealing with that. Joycelyn, hey, your view on that?
On what particular
point? Well, this particular, that it is going to make a difference. It is going to revolutionise the system, and it's going to provide you with more choice and a better variety of service.
It's going to revolutionise the system, but I'm not sure about more choice. I think we're going to get more of the same, and I think the evidence is already there in the trends that we see in the quality programmes, documentary programmes in particular, like the ITV series Legacy, like Mapping the World, wonderful series. They're after 11 o'clock at night when most people are in bed, although we're here tonight. We are concerned about this. We're concerned about where the money is going to come from in many ways. Is it going to come from sponsorship or co-production? And those, I think, both erode editorial freedom. And we hope very much that the ITC now will make the best of what is a very bizarre system and monitor and conduct proper research into viewers' perceptions and changes in that perception over time. So that before, for instance, Channel 5 comes up for auction, there's a better system. And also the independent national radio franchises. Don't forget we've had a fiasco over the first INR franchise too.
Well, let's bring in Steve Morrison from Granada, who's been itching to come in from Manchester.
Thanks. I was very interested in what the last speaker had to say, because none of us have mentioned so far the role of the ITC in how they adjudicated this system. The system started off with the emphasis being on the highest bid. Through a process of argument and months, it became ameliorated by a very tough quality hurdle, which George Russell, the head of the ITC, called Beecher's Brook. And the result today was a result for quality. The ITC chose the quality bids wherever they could. Wherever the system allowed them to, they chose quality, which is what I think will benefit the viewer. And the thing that will keep ITV making the high quality programs and the wide range of programs will be the ITC. They're the ones who are going to insist on the level of spend that we all put in to keep the network's schedule good, to keep up the quality that's in the network schedule. Because if you've got companies in the same federal system who bid £2,000 at one end and £60 million or £45 million at the other end, they're going to have very, very different ideas about how much they can afford. And it will be the ITC who will insist that the quality is kept up, as they did today.
But I mean, quite frankly, would you have been so effusive in your praise of the ITC if it had come out the other way for you?
We believed from the beginning that the gap in quality between us and our rival was so wide that that was the essential point in our franchise contest. And I agree with Clive Leach that if that gap is very wide, then you fight on quality. If the gap gets very, very narrow, then you have to fight on price. But it is the gap in quality which is the thing the viewer is interested in, not whether somebody bid £5 million more than somebody else.
Phil Redmond, I see you muttering under your breath from a safe distance from Steve Morrison. What do you think about that? That the quality threshold prevailed, that they didn't go down the market view?
Yeah, I think just on that one point there, there's a slight sort of like, what I would say, misinterpretation. I mean, it wasn't a choice of whether our quality was better than Granada's or Granada was better than ours. It was supposed to be an objective test to see whether you actually got through the quality threshold, and that's what we're a bit disappointed about. But again, I think we are in danger of missing the sort of fundamental change that's happened today, which is actually that we've ended up with a system that has been skewed slightly. What we've got is the larger companies are actually going to be paying less into the network, and the smaller companies are going to have to be paying more. And what we'll actually end up with in about 3 or 4 years' time is 3 or 4 companies who, in a sense, have taken all freight, have been given a license to print money. They'll be the companies with the resources to actually invest in programming. They're the ones who will dominate actually the program that's on the network. What we'll end up with is back to a kind of cosy, cartel, non-competitive system that we had. It's not even going back to 1980. This has actually taken us back to about 1968.
Well, yeah, before I bring in LWT, because of course they're involved in 2 bids, as are some other people. Ray Snoddy, what about that view that we're going to contract and we're going to have basically a virtual monopoly?
There is indeed a danger of that, but after 1994, I know people like Leslie Hill have got ambitions to use some of their ill-gotten gains to take a larger slice of the ITV system, and I think that may be inevitable.
Well, I mean, on that point,
Leslie
picking up something that Phil Redmond said, the fact is that the system's a very expensive one because we have 15 PLC companies all running a network. So it is expensive. There's much duplication. That is one of the reasons why ITV is a more expensive system than the BBC. Also, of course, the regional service of the viewer is very much greater than the BBC's, and that's another reason. And I'm not sure that we can continue to afford duplication of some of the services.
What about this, Christopher Bland, this idea that we're going to contract and the viewer's not going to get the same choice?
Well, I think the viewers will get the same choice. And can I endorse as an incumbent what Charles Denson and others have said? One of the most interesting changes that's going to take place is the increased strength of the independent. And that will come about not only because of what's happened today, but also because of what is going to happen at the BBC during the next 5 years. And what we actually want for independence to mean anything is a really strong independent sector. And I agree with Alan Peacock on only one thing, and that is a 40% quota would have been much more interesting than a 25% quota. But what we shouldn't get away from is the fact that the system we've all gone through today is a lousy system for deciding the ownership of the right to broadcast. You've heard enough to realize that it is bizarre, it favors the optimist, it favors all other things being equal, the greenfield bidder against the sitting tenant, and it's only the ITC that's been able to preserve any kind of continuity in the system. It's a lousy system, and Alan Peacock has a lot to answer for.
First of all, it was certainly not the system which we proposed. That was the first thing, but I won't go into that in any detail. I think the point I want to make is that the impression I get is the viewer is somebody to be looked after, to be coddled in some sort of way, as if the viewers were not sophisticated choosers. If you people go down market and produce lots of odd sitcoms twice over, 3 times over, you produce old films, they will desert you. There are other alternatives. There is satellite television, there is cable. Nobody's mentioned these things. The viewer is a rather sophisticated animal as far as is concerned. They're not Pavlovian dogs reacting to your particular programs, and I think you should bear that in mind.
Sir Alan, are you absolutely sure that the quality monitor is going to be sound enough?
Well, the question of how you define quality is a very interesting question, and nobody really around us, we can't do that in the course of a few minutes.
And it never has been. Surely the ITV came to a formula.
We tried very, very hard, and we tried in a very consistent way to say that the problem with public service broadcasting is to find the things which viewers want to support and which are non-commercial. And that was why we suggested that the proceeds of the franchise might be used, and perhaps later on the license fee, as a way of financing public service broadcasting. So those who made bids would get a return in order to support programs of this sort. And there are all kinds of ways in which this can be done. That was completely neglected in the whole discussion, and I know the reasons why the independent companies don't really want to look at that kind of thing, and why ITC doesn't want to look at it, because they're regulators, and they like to think regulation is a nice thing to be able to do.
Alan Peacock has no idea how ITV companies work. We spend all our time thinking about the viewers.
I'm
we live
sure
by
you do,
ratings,
yes.
by audience appreciation
Yes.
indexes,
Yes.
by the way our series, our programs,
Yes. Every
our current
businessman
affairs
says the
work.
same thing. Our only interest is the welfare of the customer.
Can we
Right, well,
But it's possibly true.
I would like to move on to Nick Fraser. He is one of these strange new beasts, an independent producer. Can you offer the sort of quality that the viewers will want? Will you get the chance to have your ideas accepted on the network, do you think?
I hope so. I'm actually here because I did a bid that included a lot of independent producers. The bid passed the quality threshold. It was a very good bid. I mean, we bid,
You bid for Yorkshire.
20 million less than Sir Clive over there, so I think he made an astonishing
But as an
overbid.
independent, what
But
is
it seems to me, it's
That
barely
ridiculous?
even worth
Come and see
answering
the
that question. There are loads of terrific independent productions made each year. The independents have proved again and again and again they can make good programs. They just need a larger share. I think it depends largely how this central scheduler is going to work. We stood up for independent access to the network. We stood up for open competition, and that is very important.
Well, in fact, we have a possible central scheduler here, Charles Denton from PACT. There's a slight possibility that you may take that role. Now, you may have...
That's your view. It's not a view that has ever been discussed with me.
Well, that's a possibility. Let's say you would you refuse it?
I didn't know you were empowered to offer it.
Well, just say you were offered it and you didn't refuse it. Would you be, would you be in favour of taking straight from independents? That would be very much the role of the central scheduler.
Getting away from the jokes about who might or who might not be that person. It's absolutely vital that there's free, competitive programme access, both from the companies and their programme-making arms and from every single independent producer in this country. How you deal with that is quite a complicated subject, and a complicated subject that the companies have got to address very, very fast indeed. Every day that they cease to address it is a day when in 1993 they will be in competitive trouble.
Affect Will Wyatt of a central scheduler coming up with this kernel eventually after all this turmoil. How is it going to affect the BBC?
Well, we don't know how it's going to work yet. I expect a more commercial Channel 3 schedule. I think some of the things that are in the middle of the evening will go. And when you're talking about quality, however you would describe it, it's not just about surface sheen. It's about depth. It's about range. It's about mix. And it's not just.
Let Will Wyatt finish and bring in Gus MacDonald.
It's not just to do with one kind of program or another kind of program, which I felt Stratton was rather suggesting. As for the Channel 3 show, I mean, I hope it's strong and I hope it's full of the kind of programs people here today say they want to make. And I hope that the commercial circumstances in which they're able to operate will enable them to do so. I don't think all those questions are answered yet.
Do you think we might see the bill on BBC?
I have no idea whether you'll see the bill on BBC. No one's come to offer it to me.
Gus MacDonald, you want to come in?
I'd just like to make the point that despite all the huge distractions of the last few years, the fact is ITV is the most popular channel in Britain. It's thumping the BBC at the moment. We spend more money on ITV, I think, than probably any other channel in the world. It's got an enormous clout. A lot of the money goes into very popular upmarket drama. So I won't really be patronised by people like Alan suggesting that we're not looking after
Well, let's just let Will Wyatt back in on that.
Surely.
No, Will Wyatt must come back in at the right point.
I wasn't patronising Gus. I think there is a lot of good stuff on ITV. What I was saying is when we get into the new world, it has yet to be proven. There will be other kinds of pressures.
But we'll have to become more commercial. If we become more commercial, we might murder you, and then you'll end up with advertising on it.
Well, when I say commercial, I mean a more populist channel. I'd be very surprised if we didn't have a more populist channel 2 years from now.
Ray Snow, you want to put a question to
I do want to change tack just a little bit. John Perris, what does the advertiser make of all these squabbling broadcasters? Are you getting a good deal out of them now, and will you get a good deal in future?
Yes, well, look, frankly, it doesn't impact too much on the advertising industry, because as long as the viewers are there, that'll be fine. But back to this quality hurdle issue, I mean, I think I'd like to paint a worse scenario, because if we haven't discussed the viewer much this evening, we certainly haven't discussed something else which is going on, which seems to have escaped most of the UK television industry. It's something called Europe. And by any standards, most of the broadcasters in this room are minnows up against the networks in Italy or France or Germany. And I'd like to paint a scenario that says that, frankly, because of what the ITC has done, and because of this system, that I think in '94, when the moratorium ends, most of the companies here are going to be gobbled up by continental European media conglomerates. And they will have paid a very full price to obtain these companies. and they will set about stripping out costs and providing programmes which get them their money back as soon as possible.
Ray.
Now, I don't think that's always going to be in the interest of the diverse range of programming which advertisers want as well as viewers in this country, and I don't think the ITC will be able to do anything about it whatsoever, because the example I would use is faced with the same reality in the BSB situation just last year. The ITC had no choice, and I think they made a very sensible choice, because if they continued to insist that BSB stuck to remit which they put in, there wouldn't be BSB and there wouldn't be Sky, and the viewer would have even less choice than they've got now.
What do you think could actually be done to stop what you clearly believe would be a rather devastating effect on our broadcasting
I think it's probably
system?
too late unless the ITC and the Home Office is prepared to countenance some friendly mergers amongst folk here.
Steve Morrison from Granada, come in now.
Well, there are things to be done about what John Peris is saying. Almost every week we are in conversations with a European or an American broadcaster. They also have economic pressures in their own system. As more and more channels multiply, their income splinters. Therefore, no channel will be able to afford the full cost of a very high quality, expensive program. Therefore, we will need to find partnerships between strong producers. And that is what I think the ITC, in a way, has also been trying to do. They've tried to pick the companies that they believe will be able to sustain a strong service, and therefore they'll be able to enter into these partnerships. If we don't do that, we'll all crumble into 1,000 tiny fishes, none of which can swim in the sea.
Well, let's talk about that with Roger Lawton. Do you think you've been chosen for that very reason?
No. Steve's partly right. He's talking about production relationships, but the structure is something which we should be concerned about. The companies are going to be too small, and on the European stage, with companies in France and Italy and Germany playing to different rules, there's a danger that British independent television companies will simply be outgunned because of the regulations here. It was interesting at the recent Royal Television Society conference in Cambridge that there was no talk whatsoever about British television in a European context. And that's something we'll have to start doing very soon.
We haven't heard from Hugh Pyle yet, who was successful with Sunrise against TVAM. This is slightly away from you, but not necessarily. What do you think about that, that there's going to be this kind of European onslaught?
I think it depends not only on the intentions of the Europeans, but the robustness of the finances of the domestic companies. And if those companies are going to be robust, as in our case we will be, then the chances are less.
Well, Richard Branson, just say you're not successful with your court action and 1994 comes along, and you say you've built up this expertise. I mean, should these people around here be worried? Are you going to go after a television station?
I think they're pretty safe from us, because we like building companies from scratch and not buying companies that are already up and going. But
dirty linen, dirty goods.
Yeah, I mean, it's so, and it's sad, I think, that we're going to have to wait 20 years before we can have another another go. And I think it's sad that tonight that you know, as I said earlier, that the ITC have left all their incumbents in throughout. I think that Granada, they were so determined to keep Granada that I think they cut out a lot of other people because of that, and I think that would be an interesting book one day.
Well, Chantavelovsky, from the point of view of someone who believes in this system, do you agree briefly that it's sad that there's going to be another 20 years before anything can actually be done, bar, of course, takeovers after 94?
There are quite two separate issues here. One is, if we decide we're going to have an ITV system, how do we allocate the franchises? And most of the characters in this room fought for the preservation of the ITV system, with a few exceptions who wanted mergers between areas because the areas are uneconomic. And they wanted all sorts of tinkering around, and they got the system that they got. And I think it's much better and more workable than the old system. If we're talking about the strength of British broadcasting versus the Europeans, then we wouldn't pick this system at all. We would have a much more competitive system. We would have allowed more channels in the country. The ITC backed, or the IBA backed BSB, which was a fiasco from beginning to end. And Murdoch moved in with his Sky channels and took them out. The point is that we should have a more competitive system if we want to be commercially robust, but we're not. And we've got this system for the allocation of franchises for the preservation of regional broadcasting as it exists in this country.
But that's a perfectly reasonable thing to want to preserve. One of the strengths of the ITV system is its regional broadcasting ability. And actually, many of us think it's a price worth paying in terms of some underutilization of resources in Scotland, in the north of England. I think regional broadcasting makes sense. Actually, the most efficient system would be a single ITV company. I don't think that's in the interests of the United Kingdom or of broadcasting.
John Sanderson, your background is in the city. You understand the language of takeovers and mergers. Is that sort of thing possible in British television in the future, in your view?
It may be possible, but I suspect that, on the whole, the existing companies will be perfectly pleased to see new partners coming in if they are bringing money and access to new markets, which will enable more money to be brought into the system for good programming. So I'm not sure whether it will in fact be necessary.
Harry Turner from TSW want to come in on that point.
Yes, I think it underlines the farce we've just been through. If in 1994 the moratorium ends, I believe that John Perris is right. I believe that all the new broadcasters, whether they're incumbents or newcomers, are likely to be swallowed up with new partners anyway. So why did we go through all this pain and agony? Why couldn't we have just been given rolling contracts and told you're available to be taken over in the marketplace as from now? Then the system would have found its own level. The market would have spoken.
Is that we've got the wrong people running broadcasting companies.
Aha!
They come from a regulated system and they're incompetent to deal with a competitive environment.
Let's Leslie Hill from Central view on that. Thank you.
Having spent 35 years in other forms of business, may I say that that may have been true 4 or 5 years ago, but I would say today that ITV has changed dramatically. Most of the ITV companies are running on a much more commercial basis than they were 5 years ago. There has been a dramatic change.
This money.
Let's get down to really important matters like filthy money. I would like to know how many new millionaires there are in this audience tonight, arising from the franchising system. Leslie Hill, you've done all right?
Certainly not. I mean, our golden handcuff scheme is very modest, actually.
Let's just get a voice of a viewer in here. Yes, Joyce and Hay. I mean, do you have this depressing view of what's actually going to happen subsequent to this?
Yes, I do, because I think Leslie Hill has said the ITV companies are much more commercial than they were, and we're already seeing it in the schedule. Now, we are faced, as we've just heard, with another 2 or 3 years of instability, and that's going to have an effect on the schedule. And whilst I think very much we must be talking about the pace of change, because Alan Peacock has been talking about cable and satellite. They will come, but not for a long time yet. Yes, and don't forget that at least a third of all British households will never be able to have satellite. And the further north you go, the more difficult it becomes and the more expensive.
David Lawson, from a new franchise owner, can you give any idea of reassurance very briefly? No, we're just winding up now. I want to get a view from a new incumbent.
Fancy being a David. Sorry, what was the question?
The question is, do you think, do you have this depressing view? Can you reassure the viewer that we're not having this, this contraction?
Well, I'm clearly going to reassure the viewer. I think a lot of the nature of this debate has been because 20 people have been sat in the studio, all chipping in from different angles, and the nature of the discussion would suggest that all sorts of problems are about to emerge. There's all sorts of agreements that are likely to emerge. In particular, I suspect that the way ITV will be scheduled and commissioned will be sorted out quickly rather than slowly, because everybody who's going into the network has the same interest, and that's an extremely successful network starting on the 1st of January 1993. Well, needless to say, we're a bit optimistic.
Well, after that advert, thank you very much indeed. Well, after all the suits on the Late Show tonight, tomorrow night the studio will be full of women as invited audience cross-examines Germaine Greer on her controversial new book, The Change. But for now, good night.
It's hot.